So the lived experience of patients has always been a really important part of EASD, and to talk lived experience and how that can impact on this year's EASD and indeed much more widely, I've got two outstanding patient advocates. So I have Bastian Hauck, patient advocate, entrepreneur, economist, most important of all perhaps, founder of DDoc, lives with type 1 diabetes, and also Renza Scibilia, from Melbourne, Australia, who is author of one of Australia's most popular health blogs, Diabetogenic. Welcome to you both. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here.
So,
thank you.
Renza, tell me the work that you're doing.
Sure. So my day job is I work for Diabetes Australia, and I spend a lot of time working across a number of different teams there. So our policy and advocacy team, our comms team, but also very much ensuring that that lived experience features very much front and centre in everything that we do. I'm a diabetes advocate and activist. You mentioned that I write a blog. I write elsewhere as well. And I'm very much there to make sure that that lived experience is always at the front of people's minds. When we're talking about anything to do with diabetes, we've got to remember that there are people living with diabetes. So my catch cry, I guess, that I love is nothing about us without us. So I'm so thrilled that you're giving us a platform here today to talk about what that means at a conference as big as EASD.
And I was reflecting earlier in the week that this is the centenary of the discovery of insulin. And of course, it was the very first medical discovery that actually passed power into the patient's hands, because never before had patients been allowed to inject themselves. And patients, and particularly their involvement with devices, has been a defining part of diabetes ever since. So there's a long history here. But I know that one of the areas you've been involved in particular is about the use of language, which is a bit of a hobby horse of mine as well, I have to tell you. So tell me a bit more about that.
Yes, well, the Language Matters movement, because we love to give a name and a hashtag to things, don't we? The Language Matters movement started, well, I was going to say it started 10 years ago when Diabetes Australia, the organisation I work for, launched our first language position statement, but that's actually really not true. Discussing the language and communication and the way that diabetes is spoken about and the way that people with diabetes are spoken to has been something that's been a topic of great interest and great discussion and great debate and arguments and all sorts of things in the diabetes community for decades. I've been living with diabetes now for 23 years, and I remember it was one of the first things that I noticed was this, how people like to be spoken to and how, I guess, disempowering language can often be. But 10 years ago, Diabetes Australia said, hey, let's get something out there. So we've at least got something we can hold on to say, this is, perhaps a better way to do this. This is what can be harmful. And that was really what kicked off, I guess, this movement in terms of there being some really decent research around it. Other diabetes organisations jumped on board and said, hey, this is something really, really important. We've seen more and more research, and we're talking about it a lot. Language is so powerful. And, as I said, 23 years ago I was diagnosed with diabetes. I can still remember the words that my very first endocrinologist spoke to me the day that I was diagnosed. That is how much power words have. It stays with us. So this movement is really important. And conferences are a really great place to highlight what's being done super well, language that's really inclusive and empowering and not negative, but also to point out the stuff that actually can be quite stigmatising and that can be really quite blaming and shaming to people with diabetes.
Give me a good example of something that is a use of shaming language. I mean, I can think of a lot of examples, but you tell me some.
Oh, look, the one that is like nails down a chalkboard for me is versions of non-compliant and compliant. and non-adherent and adherent.
Yes.
There's this idea that it's, this willful, deliberate misbehaving of the person with diabetes. And I just find that, it speaks completely against what you just spoke about, that whole thing about, people with diabetes being given this power because we're injecting insulin ourselves. We get to spend about 4 hours a year with a health professional. The rest of the time we're doing this on our own. So to suddenly have health professionals telling us off and calling us non-compliant, that's a really tough pill to swallow, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's one of the
How do you stop?
terms.
You're an Australian. How do you stop just sitting there and saying, "Get back in your box"?
Oh, I do say that. See, you don't know me. That's exactly what I say. And poor Bastian has heard me say that. Although, I think the thing that's wonderful is that we're having to say it less and less, because over this 10-year period, maybe people are just they just want to keep us quiet, and so they're not saying it as much. But so many wonderful, advocates and so many amazing health professionals and researchers and academics understand this, and they're very much, they're waving the flag alongside us, thankfully.
Bastian, is that something that you're finding, that in Europe you're also winning the battle for language?
I don't like war rhetorics in this, because I don't believe in fighting against each other. I'm a diplomat by training. My background is in economics and diplomacy. So I very much believe in working alongside each other, as Renza just said, working with each other. But I certainly do feel that the winds have changed. I'm a sailor by heart as well. This got me to advocacy in the first place. So yes, I do feel a lot of change. Just as an example, you asked for a good example of a bad use of language, let's say. When I was diagnosed almost 25 years ago now, one of the first words I heard from the doctor treating me in hospital was, "Mr. Hauck, you are now a diabetic." Full stop. That was like him redefining my whole, being. Versus, and that's where, sometimes people ask us, is it really that important that we say a person living with diabetes versus a diabetic? But it does make a difference in how.
Well, a diabetic makes you sound like an alien, doesn't it? You are now a diabetic. You have now gone to another planet and been another kind of person. And actually, you're still the same
I'm so many things. I'm so many things. Yes, I have diabetes. I'm also a brother. I'm a son. I'm a lover. I'm a friend. I'm, depending on the context. And I'm also maybe in some context a diabetic, but living with diabetes is more like something that is one of many things. Versus if you tell someone you are now a diabetic, it's like, that's who you are. Congratulations.
So, Renza, So Renza, I'm not going to use battle analogy, but we are definitely making strides within the diabetes community right across research and clinicians and patients. But are we winning that? Must stop saying fight. But maybe this is a fight here. Are we winning the fight in the media and in the wider community?
Oh, gosh, I think that's where we've still got a bit of way to go. So the first, before I talk about that though, I just want to say that one of the things that's really important about the whole language movement is that it's not about tone policing people with diabetes. So I personally don't refer to myself or people with diabetes as diabetics, but I know probably it's actually split pretty close down the middle, I think. And the latest research we did at Diabetes Australia showed that 50% of people are happy to use the term, 50% would prefer not to. This isn't about what we use, it's about what other people use. But the media is, it's tricky. Gosh, comedians love a diabetes joke. They think that it's hilarious. They think that diabetes is fair game, that we can have that stigmatizing jokes about diabetes are absolutely okay. So, we're really struggling with that. What with the community understanding what diabetes is, understanding how challenging it is, how serious it is, how frustrating and relentless, and all of those things that anybody in any way touched by diabetes understands. And so that's really tough, which is one of the reasons why those language position statements, I think, are quite important, because they give us a tool that we can hand to journalists and say, please use this. This language is great to use. Or, at a conference, handing it out to speakers and saying, please align your presentation with this language so that we know that it is not in any way going to be judgmental to people with diabetes who are listening in. We've still got a long way to go there. We really do. The community attitudes about diabetes are pretty shocking. Diabetes Australia ran a campaign during our National Diabetes Week about diabetes stigma, and we highlighted just some of those things. People think that it's fair game to tell people with diabetes what we can and what we can't eat, to take a piece of cake away from us, because how dare us even think about eating a cupcake, or criticising us for needing to do our diabetes tasks, for needing to check our blood glucose or inject insulin in public, and people getting all offended because we need to do that. There's so much living with diabetes, to have this stigma and dealing with community attitudes on top of it is really, really tricky. We do still have a long way to go, unfortunately, but we keep chipping away, because I do think that we will get there. It just takes time.
Important thing, I guess, is to make sure that you've mobilised everybody within the diabetes community to be that advocate in the outside community, because you need the whole of clinicians and patients and nurses, all those kind of people involved in taking the message out to the wider community. And I'm so glad to hear both of you say that you think that the community element of it is within diabetes is largely, if not settled, then certainly much better. But now I guess it's getting it out there to a much wider set of people, particularly the media. Bastian, tell me what you're going to be doing with DDoC.
So DDoC is a community of diabetes patient advocates. It's a community of people like me, like Renza, like many, many, many others out there that we have also been growing over the last decade or so. And a couple of years back, I was wondering why people living with diabetes were hardly ever invited to conferences like this, like EASD. And I thought I would like to change that. There were some people coming in through diabetes patient organizations because they had an official role there, like I was fortunate to have. There were some people, bloggers, influencers, as some call them, who were being invited by a pharma or a medtech company to maybe then write about it. But that wasn't quite what I thought we should be after. It was more really being there as one of the most important stakeholders. If there's researchers and doctors and nurses and industry, the people living with diabetes, I thought, should also be at these conferences. And they have always been to a little degree, but we never had our own stage. So what we started a couple of years back was Doc Day, the day for the diabetes online community, a day by, for, and with people living with diabetes. And things have changed. You asked at the beginning about language, but also about this role of people living with diabetes and the patient voice. Things have changed a lot, mostly also because, as I said, more and more people from the HCP side have been joining us in this effort. I would specifically like to point out Chantal Mathieu, the vice president of EASD, who has been a huge supporter of ours over the last years. And she has also been inviting us to this EASD and making Doc Day a central part of the virtual world now. Last year, we had our own booth, this year again, and we will have Doc Day on Thursday. Doc standing for Diabetes Online Community. Doc Day is our 2-3 hour event where we will have diabetes patient advocates from all over the world talking about what matters to them, what they consider relevant. Very, very short, 5-minute, presentations, pitches. And in the past, we did actually talk a lot about language matters and the position papers that Renza mentioned. This year, a lot will be about stigma and about how people living with diabetes in their real world feel about what you were just mentioning, the media, the society, the community as such. So it will be really interesting spotlights on individuals from all over Europe, from Australia, where Renza is also going to be speaking, from Pakistan, from Africa. We'll have so many interesting voices. And I really hope that the EASD community will join us, listen in. It's on Facebook Live. We're streaming it on our website, ddoc.org. Please come by and listen to some of these voices. It'll be really interesting. Some great projects also that will be presented there.
And the switch to digital has been transformational for many patient voices. I don't know why it was expected that patients somehow had no jobs to go to and no families to care for, and that they would just be expected to just, jump ship and run off to some congress in some distant part of the world and do something almost for nothing and then come back and expect to sort that out and be part of their lives. It was always an expectation too far, I thought. But digital has been transformational here, hasn't it?
It has been, although even before COVID, DDoC has launched its own scholarship program. It's called the DDoC Voices. And at ATTD last year, which was the week before COVID struck all of us, we actually handed out 23 scholarships for diabetes patient advocates from all over Europe to come to Madrid, attend the conference face-to-face in person. So we paid for their flights, their hotel, accommodation, food, etc., had a proper room there. So we actually designed this program to be enabling people living with diabetes to join face-to-face. COVID then changed that, of course, but we are really hoping to go back to DDoC Voices being present at a conference face-to-face when EASD will hopefully become a real conference again, or a hybrid conference maybe next year. For now, however, you're right. The virtualization of things has its downsides, because we really miss, like I'm sure everybody here at EASD, we miss these face-to-face interactions. I always considered some of the most important conversations were taking place in between lectures, in between symposia, at the coffee table, walking from room A to room B. But on the other hand, for us, it has been almost a fortune, because we've been expanding our reach and we've been able to include so many more people. Like I said, in the beginning, it was only for advocates from Europe. Now, virtually, of course, whether we have an advocate from Pakistan or from Liberia or from Zimbabwe or from Central America, it doesn't really matter. It's a Zoom link. Join us. And reaching out via Facebook Live is the same thing. So it has been transformational to the good, but I really, really look forward to going back to face-to-face as well. We will go hybrid, as will EASD.
Now, I have to ask you both about the impact of COVID on people living with diabetes, because it's been pretty devastating and it's left a lot of people very fearful. How are you dealing with that as patient advocates?
Well, I'm in lockdown currently in Melbourne. I think that we
You've been locked down a lot in Melbourne, haven't you?
over the other day as being the city that's been in lockdown longest. But I really appreciate this question, because I think there has been a lot of fear and concern and uncertainty. People with diabetes just worrying about what COVID means. We know that diabetes doesn't play nice with any sort of infection, and anybody who has had, the flu before, any sort of infection knows that managing diabetes on top of that is really tough. So this, there's so much I think that we're still learning. Working at a diabetes organisation, we've spent a lot of time making sure that we're giving the right information out there, because that, of course, is another thing, is people needing to wade through the misinformation. There is so much misinformation out there, and making sure that we're being factual and evidence-based all the time, encouraging people to get out there and get vaccinated as soon as they possibly could, and to do all of those public health measures to keep themselves safe, distance, hands, all of those things. And I think that anybody living with any sort of chronic health condition has had all the concerns that everybody else has, but there is always, as diabetes tends to do, there is an extra degree of difficulty in there. So from my little lockdown corner of the world here, I'm feeling quite cocooned still, but our borders will open at some point, and that's going to mean I will be able to get back to Europe soon. But in the meantime, it's very much a wait and see and learn. We're continuing to learn so much.
Bastian, how has the impact of diabetes been felt in Europe?
Pretty much so. Mostly, I think it was the feeling of insecurity, of not knowing how much worse this would affect someone living with diabetes to someone not living with diabetes. And I actually think this feeling of not knowing was even worse than maybe the actual increased risk, because I saw a lot of people living with diabetes kind of self-isolating even more than the general public. And we all know how hard COVID has been on every bit of society. But people with diabetes felt it even more because in the beginning, especially, there was misinformation, but there was also lack of knowledge about what does it actually mean. I know from myself, when I got my second shot, how big of a relief that was, feeling that I'm a bit safer now, at least. And I have to admit, I did something that probably the average person cannot do. I kind of left my country. I left Berlin because I felt it weighing down on me so much. So I've spent most of last year in Copenhagen, in Denmark, where right now, as you might have heard from the news, all the restrictions have been released. The vaccination rate here is very high. The COVID rates are quite low, and it means the world to me. But for the average person living with diabetes, it's still much more of a concern than for anybody else, I think.
And I guess for you, this is a question for you both really, that we're now seeing an increase in cases of diabetes after people have had COVID. And I'm guessing that that's something that you'll want to draw to the attention of the wider society to make sure that this is picked up in early stages. Renza?
Look, I think that it feeds very much into what is a constant thread that runs through the community and runs through patient organisations and through researchers and academics. It's all about early detection, early treatment, best outcomes, often, and we hear, before COVID, we just heard so many stories of people misdiagnosed, and their diagnosis missed completely. And so hopefully now, health professionals are aware, especially GPs are aware that, doing a check for, could this be diabetes is really, really important. And we know that really needs to be happening in people who have had COVID. But once again, that's why, knowing things like what are the symptoms of diabetes, and everybody out, if I say to the EASD community, know your 4 T's of type 1 diabetes: toilet thirsty, thinner, and I've forgotten the last one. What am I doing here? The 4 T's. Everybody would know what they are,
Tiredness.
But except for me, because I just had sorry?
Tiredness.
It's toilet, tired, thirsty, thinner. There you go. Everybody in the diabetes world would know what that is, but we need to get that outside the diabetes world, so that if somebody is saying, I've got those symptoms, that they're going to their GP and saying, can you please check if I could possibly have diabetes? And now is a really great time for that to be at the front of everybody's mind.
And Sebastian, the other part of this is there are a lot of people, of course, who have not been diagnosed in the first place. But another element, which is really important, is people who have not been getting their usual care. And that's something that's really important for patient advocates to shout about.
Yes, of course. I mean, even myself, I didn't want to. I wasn't very fond of going to see my endocrinologist during times of COVID, because I perceived that would, be more risky than maybe staying at home and postponing a certain appointment until what I thought in spring last year. after this would be over. We've seen that a lot, that appointments have been postponed, have been delayed, have been canceled altogether, or that the services just weren't available because everybody was busy with COVID also in the healthcare system. I want to get back to one more thing, though, that was Renza and you just touched upon earlier. You were saying, about the need of getting it out there, getting the word out in general, for example, on COVID and diabetes and how that relates. Look, I'm not a researcher, right? Most people living with diabetes, most diabetes patient advocates are not. I want to get back to why it is so important to have DDoC and the DDoC voices attending EASD, because this is one of the largest scientific conferences in the world. This is where this kind of research, first notch, will be shared, will be discussed, will be presented. And I think it is so important to have these diabetes advocates, these people who compute that, who then translate what they hear into not only different languages. Our diabetes advocates, as I said, it's more than 100 in the DDoC Voices group now. They're from all over the world. So they might translate what they hear into Italian, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, whatever. But what is more important, they will translate it into lay language. They will filter what they consider is relevant for their communities, for the community of people living with diabetes. And they will make sure that this top-notch research will be heard very, very quickly, live from EASD, basically, via Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever it is, via their social media channels. And this, I think, is also so important. When we created DDoC Voices, we said we believe in the value diabetes patient advocates bring to these conferences. Because I think we bring the lived experience to the EASD community, to the researchers, to the HCPs, but also because we take the knowledge that is being presented there and relay it to our communities. Pay it forward is what we call it. We do not invite diabetes advocates to EASD only because we think they are good and they will learn. We invite them based on what we know, how much they can spread the word. Paying it forward means take whatever you learn, whatever you hear, break it down to what's relevant to you, translate it into lay and whatever other language you may speak, and make sure it gets out there to the community. This is what we're doing with DDoC Voices and with Doc Day.
What's brilliant about patient advocates is that they are able to encapsulate what a piece of research means. And I think
exactly.
that's the key thing that patient advocates are able to do beyond almost anyone else, translate what the research means. And I don't just mean means in its science sense, I mean means as in what are the long-term impacts? How does it affect other practice? And I think they're as good as telling some doctors that as they are people living with diabetes, because sometimes it's quite complicated stuff, and actually the patients are able to assimilate that knowledge and pass it on to people who perhaps don't live in the diabetes world, even though they might be professionals, and that's extraordinarily helpful. Renza, is that something you find as well? This imparting of meaning is so important.
Absolutely. I think it's why we're here. It's why we come to these conferences, and it's what we're here to do. It's almost like condensing what we're hearing and putting, we used to say, give it to me as an elevator pitch. You've got the time that you're in an elevator to explain it. Now it's put it in a tweet. Because if you can't explain it in 280 characters or fewer, then you're not going to be able to get it out there effectively. And it's actually quite interesting because it's part of some of the work that we've done at Diabetes Australia is that when we have researchers, we say, how would you condense this into a tweet? And it's such a great little test to do to see, what's the really integral nitty-gritty that you want to get out there about the work that you're doing. And that's what we do. We sit there in these lectures that are sometimes, I'm not a health professional. I am not a scientist. I'm a classical flute player, for goodness sake. So I don't, my history is absolutely not, is not science. So I'm sitting there and trying, we become very good at grabbing those nuggets and those sound bites and getting that out. And that's what gets the community interested. And then we write about it in more detail later on, but it's getting those little snapshots to get out there so that people say, oh, wow, that is something I want to be involved in. Because the whole beauty of that is when you've got people excited about the research, you need research participants. We're those participants. So when we're talking about it, when we're sharing about what's going on, researchers love it when we do that, because then when it comes time to them going to the community and saying we need participants, people are more likely to put up their hand and say, hey, yeah, I'll do it. I'll roll up my sleeve, take some blood, whatever you need to do. I'm keen on being involved in this.
I think the pair of you are brilliant. I salute you. But I want to go out with an advert. So, Bastian, would you please advertise shamelessly and brazenly your upcoming day? Over to you.
I'll be more than happy to do so. I think I've said it before. Please, everyone at EASD, if you can afford the time, it's about 2 hours, join us on Thursday, noon Central European time, for our doc day, the day for the lived experience. People living with diabetes from all over the world doing these elevator pitches, 5 minutes each, presenting what matters to them, what things they've seen at EASD or what they do in their advocacy work, what they care for. Thursday, ddoc.org, dedoc.org is the website, or you can find our Facebook event. It'll be live streamed on Facebook. So join us there. I hope to see you. It will be a lot of fun as well.
Who could resist an invitation like that? Bastian, Hauck, Renza, Scibilia, thank you so much. It's been a joy talking to you.
Oh,
thank you for having us.
Lovely.